You're listening to Digital Employee Experience, a show for IT changemakers. Let's get into the show.
Hello, changemakers. I'm Tom McGrath, joined as ever by Tim Flower, Global Director for Business Transformation at Nexthink. Tim, in honor of today's extremely special guest, I would like to give you a quick philosophical interrogation, if I may. Does that sound all right with you?
Yeah, it sounds intriguing, Tom. I'm up for it.
Okay, first question. It's the most technical of my questions, actually. Tim Flower, are you an idealist or a materialist?
That's an interesting question. For many things in my life, I'm not black and white. I don't know if that fits into one or the other for me. I consider myself an idealist. I like to understand what our core belief system is, what drives us, but then I like to go drive a nice new car and have a good meal. So I think I'm a little bit of both.
Okay, I accept that. I accept that ambiguity. Next question. This is harder, I think, to be ambiguous about. Would you consider yourself a believer in free will or determinism?
Yeah, that does feel more black and white. I am more a believer of free will. We have the free will to make decisions based on our belief system and where we want to go. So I'm more on the free will side. That
is good to hear. I always find that determinists a scary crowd, if I'm completely honest with you. I wouldn't have said it if you hadn't told me that, but okay. Final question in the philosophical interrogation. Does the body rule the mind, or does the mind rule the body?
Yeah, maybe another one that's not black and white, or maybe changes over time, right? In our early years, the mind definitely rules the body. But I'm finding as I age,
for yourself.
My body is overruling my mind.
Well, okay, that's a good answer too. I found out a lot about you today, Tim, and I appreciate those answers. There's a reason for them, of course, and it is related to the fact that today's show is called Aristotle in the Digital Workplace, and that's because we are hosting the Aristotle of the Digital Workplace, or the workplace more generally. Dr. Brennan Jacoby, philosopher and founder of Philosophy at Work. Dr. Brennan Jacoby, a very warm welcome to the Digital Employee Experience show.
Thanks so much, Tom. And Tim, it's great to be here.
Should we call you Dr. Jacoby, or is Brennan okay with you?
Brennan is great. Yeah.
Well, that's very humble of you, Brennan. Thank you very much. And let's begin, please, by hearing something about yourself and about Philosophy at Work.
Yeah, so my name is Brennan Jacoby. I'm originally from Michigan, Detroit more specifically. I did my PhD in philosophy in Australia, where I was focusing on trust and betrayal. And that got me into thinking about not just sort of doing philosophy in the academic context, but helping organizations and sort of applying the philosophy of trust to more social contexts. And this was just after the financial sort of meltdown, 2008. And as I was working with groups on trust, it became very clear that not just that topic was useful, but actually the philosophical approach of stepping back and saying, what do we mean by, in that instance, it was trust, but with anything, what do we mean by purpose? What do we mean by trust? What's going on with, engagement or whatever the thing might be? And then also the ethics question that philosophers are so often concerned with: is this thing always good? Is trust always a good thing? Is how do we understand technology? Is tech always good? These sorts of things that, the prevalence of these kinds of questions has only increased in recent times. And I think also the recognition that such questions are not just interesting, or somehow we're glad they're being dealt with in the ivory towers, but they're also increasingly relevant to the day-to-day operational concerns of professionals. That moved me into the space of saying, do you know what, I think philosophy and reflective ways of thinking are really needed in the professional space. And so now I run a business called Philosophy at Work, where I help businesses think their best. And what that often means is I'll do sessions on, helping them lay the groundwork so that their teams can think their best. So we do things still on trust and psychological safety, because we know that you're not going to think your best if you don't feel safe. And then we do sessions on curiosity and critical thinking. How do we ask great questions so that all of us can be doing our best sort of cognition at a time when, let's face it, so much of work is knowledge-based, and our ability to think carefully is really valuable. So that's what I'm doing. I'm no longer in the US. I'm now based in the UK. and just north of Oxford, in fact.
Yeah, I think the whole topic is fascinating, connecting philosophy, not just with work, but with tech. You know, thinkers, as I think about it, and I reflect back on my career, thinkers need input, right? They need stimulation and maybe even conflict. And if it's not conflict, at least it's a problem that they need to solve, right? And there's a lot of interesting parallels there with technologists. It's not just about data and information or even knowledge. It's about wisdom and creativity of thought. So what's the traditional engagement look like for you at Philosophy with Work? What type of thinkers do you pull in, and how have they informed your approach to philosophy applied to workplace?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. So I think, a couple of things come to mind, a couple of things that are maybe useful to set out. Far be it for me to critique some of the cleverest minds throughout history, but what I think we really need today is not people who can talk about, Socrates or Simone de Beauvoir or someone, but who can do their own philosophy. And so with Philosophy at Work, we will reference historical philosophers, people that are recognized as philosophers, all the while recognizing that all of us thinks better or worse from moment to moment in terms of quality of our ideas. But so a moment ago we said we need a philosopher, right. But that doesn't mean that you have to have someone who has a PhD in philosophy. It's what I think we really need is people, again, who don't quote Socrates, but who are able to do some of that same stuff that Socrates, Mary Wollstonecraft or Hannah Arendt did. And I guess what I mean by that is the way that they ask questions, what counted as good reasons or good lines of inquiry to pursue. Right. So without philosophy, we might say, well, we're going to have an ethic of efficiency. And therefore, the right thing to do is just the fastest thing, the thing that saves us the most resource and time and money and everything. But if you look at some historical philosophical figures, you see some of that, but a lot of times you see them saying, well, no, of course not everything is about time and money. And so philosophers encourage us that they just are beginning with a different sort of set of values. And so I think it's important for people in the corporate space to balance out our appreciation for efficiency. And of course, I'm not saying that every business should just not care about money, but rather to say we need to balance those ethics with other lines of reasoning. And that's where I like to draw on the historical philosophers. So I do talk a lot about Socrates because we draw on how he asked questions. But again, the point isn't to sort of have posters of the rock star philosopher on the wall and appreciate him. It's much more about saying, oh, look what he was doing there. What would it look like for us to do that? And so I think one of the most, if I'm understanding your question correctly about what's the sort of traditional engagement, one of the most common ways that I work with companies is on helping them think about the questions that they would say they want to be asking, what counts as a good question. So, an example is I ran a session with an executive team for a global media company. And with them, we went through and we said, let's look at how philosophers have asked questions. And we looked at what Socrates was doing. We looked again at Simone de Beauvoir, what she was doing when she was asking questions in her famous book, The Second Sex, about what it means to be a woman. And we looked at what Descartes was doing when he famously said, I think, therefore I am, and uncovered some of those questions and then said, okay, apart from their actual projects, do we see a methodology here? Is there anything that we can tease out and use ourselves? And we indeed did find that, they're asking questions that are honest and humble and non-judgmental. And so we were able to say, we've all probably been in meetings where we've asked a question, or we've heard a question asked, which maybe wasn't really a question, which sort of it transcribed would have ended with a question mark, but wasn't actually, was more actually an opportunity to sort of show how clever we were or something. And that's not what we're after. Those examples of philosophers suggest that that's not what we're after. And then in that session, we were able to say, okay, so if we should be asking questions that are honest and non-judgmental and not questions that we already think we know the answers to, then what questions do you all have as executives for your business that you think are those kinds of questions that should be asked? And that's really useful for the reasons that I think particularly now where there's so much uncertainty and complexity going on, the problems we're trying to solve are not simple. And so we oftentimes have more questions than answers, and we're trying to appreciate the the work that the questions can do, rather than saying we've just got to get quickly and efficiently to an answer.
So safe to say then you're exposing the inner philosopher in all of us.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's such a brilliant way to put it, Tim. Your check is in the mail. I will post it.
A new tagline, I think.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, on the one hand, a moment ago, Tom said we all need philosophers now. And I would love to see there be more roles like the corporate philosopher or something, Patagonia, the outfitter and climbing.
The CPO, the chief philosopher officer, right?
Yeah.
We'll have a word.
Right. So, Patagonia, the outdoor outfitter and climbing kit company, they have a director of philosophy, and they're doing something different than what I'm doing with that, where they're trying to say our philosophies, our ways of thinking that are really core to our brand are so precious to us. We want to have someone really care for those. And I think this is really important, because when we say we're trying to care, we're sort of trying to draw out or release the inner philosopher. I think we have to distinguish between philosophers and philosophies. And so what I don't really teach philosophies, because it feels too presumptive to me to go into a business and say, well, let me tell you how you ought to think. But what I do want to do is help everyone to, as you say, be their own sort of philosopher. And a philosopher, I mean, if you go back to the etymology of the term in the Greek, philo means love and Sophia is wisdom. So philosophy is just love, wisdom, literally. And philosophers are, should be those that are in pursuit of wisdom. And so, if we can help people come back into touch with their natural curiosity, with the questions that are niggling in the background of their mind and they wouldn't ask because actually the meeting's almost done. But actually, if we can give them the courage to say, no, hang on, everyone, I don't think we've quite cracked this. I think this is really important. Then I think I've done my job a bit, and I think that business will be better for it, even if it's a bit uncomfortable in that moment.
So let's jump to kind of current day, Brennan. A lot of what we're dealing with right now is a shift in technology because of the pandemic. You've talked with a lot of clients about what the pandemic has meant to them. What do you think the overall impact has been on the workplace? Because it affects, like we're talking about here, it affects more than just our work styles and our tech. It affects our psyche and how we behave as well, right? So what are your clients and folks that you're working with tell you about the impact of the pandemic on them?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is that it is destabilizing, right? And that's not earth shattering. The pandemic has been incredibly destabilizing, and awfully so, right? It is a trauma that as individuals and as collective, colleagues and societies will have to be doing some intentional work to process for years to come. But if we think about how its impact on the sort of day-to-day workscape, if you could say that, it's destabilized. And while that's not earth-shattering news, I think that's important. And that's my main takeaway, because not only is that what I hear from clients when I'm talking with them is about, how it's brought a lot of change. And now, of course, people are selling up their bricks and mortar spaces in a lot of ways, or they're going to, they're hybridizing their ways of working where it's not fully virtual or distributed, but not fully together either. And all of that, of course. But the reason I say destabilizing rather than just changing is destabilizing is that word captures that sense in which we don't feel grounded and we're a little bit off of our base, right? And that's what I've noticed. And I think that's both the challenge, but also the opportunity. And I don't think that's just a nice sentiment. What I mean by that is it's destabilized us because it's shaken up what we used to do, right? So I live out near Oxford in the UK, and I used to get on the train probably 3 or 4 days a week and go into London. And now I don't do that. And like many people, that's made me think again about how I spend my day, right? Whereas before I would kind of mindlessly get into the car and drive to the train station and then mindlessly start checking email. And, I try to be mindful, but I didn't really, I was mindful about other things, but I wasn't really questioning whether or not I got on the train. Right. And so the destabilization has raised our awareness. I mean, it's been really uncomfortable because it's thrown us off. And I think as we saw last in March 2020, the destabilization meant that people went into their, you could say, stress state. And there were reactions of some people going, we're just going to go quiet and we're going to wait for this to blow over as long as we could. And then maybe a couple months and they had to make some decisions. Whereas others were sort of, you talk about fight or flight. Some people were flying away and going, we're just going to batten down the hatches. Other people were fighting into it and going, we're hanging in there. We're not going virtual. We're going to, make it through this. And neither of those is useful. Neither of those is really, like, both are completely understandable, but neither is really great. And so the destabilization brought that about. But on the upside, the opportunity, as I said before, there is an opportunity. And I think it's that whenever we have whenever we're shaken, it gives us an opportunity to notice what we had been doing previously mindlessly. And so a lot of people I've been talking to have gone, gosh, I didn't realize how much money I was unnecessarily spending on transport, or I don't know, what other things, eating lunch out all the time, whatever it was. And there's, to greater and lesser degrees, and to bigger and smaller life things. And so now there's an opportunity to go, how do we really want to do this? It's uncomfortable to be destabilized, but we're in a really important point right now where, assuming that we do come out of this period in this year at some point, then we've got some important questions to say. So what do we want to do? And I think there'll be some people that would go, can we just go back to what we know? Because that kind of feels safe. But actually, I've been hearing a lot more people that have gone, no, actually the impact on work is, there's been some important things and we want to hold on to. We've got a lot more empowered workforce, and we're a lot more flexibility, and we want to retain that while also finding a way to come together and connect when we really need to.
Yes, so many stories out there about even kids doing homework at the library just to get access to Wi-Fi, not the material in the library, right?
Yeah, totally. So I think that those are a couple of things, that I think come to mind. But at the same time, the opportunities are immense. If we can find a way to, something that I've been talking about is finding a way to connect people. So instead of having away days, now let's have together days, right? So you can do the nuts and bolts of your job at home, and then, if it's safe in the future, let's come together regularly to do the important relational stuff. I mean, that doesn't, a lot of people have been saying, well, part of what I'm missing is just the unplanned knowledge sharing, planned connections. And so what I'm talking about together days doesn't quite get that. But I'm sure there's, we've put people on the moon. I'm sure we can find ways to connect in this way. And there's great opportunities to do that. I think the autonomy, the empowerment that comes from being able to work where and whenever and connect with colleagues all around the world rather than having to get on a plane and go there is great.
Yeah, the virtual happy hours have been interesting, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of positivity and some as well.
Yeah, cool. So you have a really great piece out there. It's called Virtues of Virtual. It not only deserves a read, it deserves multiple reads. Every time I go through the content, I find something else that I want to pay attention to or dig into deeper. What are your thoughts about, and it covers some of this, right? Balancing the risk that we're talking about. And maybe specific to IT professionals, and we focus a lot on employees and enabling work for our businesses. When we talk about the IT professional specifically, any thoughts about the alignment or the risk management for an IT pro that's now dispersed from their teams and their employer and their boss, and the people that they support?
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe just a little bit of background would be useful as well. So the Virtues of Virtual was a report that we put out in 2020. And full transparency, I have to once again thank Nexthink for contributing a feature piece to that. It was really, really great. So, for anyone that's listening that hasn't picked it up, it's definitely worth a couple reads, and especially on that feature, which was great. The Nexthink's thinking about humanizing IT was really helpful to the thinking. But what we were trying to do in that report was, the title is The Virtues of Virtual. And so it might sound like we're saying the upside of going virtual, but that's not actually what we're talking about. What we're trying to do is draw on something that Aristotle said, so the ancient Greek philosopher who said that the way to live is to try to strike the balance between extremes. And the reason we call the report that is because when everything started happening with the pandemic, we noticed that, as we were talking about before, people tended to react. We did it ourselves. It's really normal, really human, but it's unhelpful. We tended to overreact or underreact. And Aristotle said that vices tend to be overreactions or underreactions of things, but virtues are just the ways of living in balance. So, for example, he talked about courage as a virtue. And, we tend to think about courage as a virtue, but what we don't tend to think about is his idea that the overreaction is something like running into battle, willy-nilly and for no good reason, right? That's not helpful. That's not virtuous. But neither is cowardice on the other side, running away, right? So for him, he says courage is a virtue because it's the balance of knowing when to show strength or when to do the right thing, right? And so in a similar way, we were trying to say, let's look at distributed teams, virtual ways of working, and say, what are the virtues of virtual? That is, what are the balanced ways of being between extremes? And we looked at areas of tech and connectivity and different things and identified a lot of overreactions and underreactions. And then, after saying each time, yeah, we get it, that's really normal, but what's the balance? And so I guess coming back to your question, thinking about IT professionals, one virtue of virtual that we identified that I think is maybe most useful is clarity. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about how so often in this space, communication can be tricky, even though we've got more and more ways to connect. I mean, the platforms on which to share our content and ideas with each other are numerous, but actual clarity about what's needed suffers. And I guess the reason I say that virtue of clarity is useful to IT is because anytime you've got professionals with a vast degree of expertise, so I would say lawyers, doctors, IT professionals who are understanding what's going on in all these incredibly fast-paced, changeable interfaces that we're all using. Anytime you have that kind of expertise, you run the risk of speaking past each other. And I think a lot of times, speaking as someone who's done a lot of work on trust, a lot of times that I think distrust comes about is not because of anything malicious, but because we just don't understand where each other's coming from. And so, if there's, I don't know, there's a lot of culture films and shows and stuff out there poking fun at like the difficult relationships between IT professionals and their colleagues, right? And I think a lot of that, the sort of things that they're blowing out of context in those kinds of shows, a lot of it would be solved if the colleagues that don't understand the IT professionals spend a bit more time in that world, right? And so the virtue of clarity is about saying, how clear is the communication, going both ways, really importantly, between, in this case, the IT professionals and their colleagues, and the degree to which we're clearly communicating, not in terms of, is it accessible? We could say, well, the memo's been sent 10 different ways, but much more, what questions might the intended audience still have? Mm-hmm. So it's the same, it's the same thing that is happening when you're in a meeting and you go, I think this makes sense. Then you get back to your desk and you go, gosh, it felt so clear, but now I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to get on with. And, I'm convinced that a lot of procrastination isn't because we're lazy, but because we just weren't clear in the first place. But we don't want to look silly and go back and ask again. And so it's that we're talking about. I think if IT professionals can keep pushing forward ways of clarity of exchange with colleagues, then that's only going to be a good thing, because especially when the office is in someone's home and it's out of sight, right? Then we're going to have to be much better able to clearly communicate. So that's one thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, that there's so much there that we could talk about, but that description of procrastination really resonates. That the delay due to not laziness, but the lack of clarity is really interesting to me. So if we look a little bit about kind of what Nexthink focuses on, which is the employee experience and the digital experience of people, to help bring more clarity to what they're doing, to help them understand what they're, how they work and what they're doing. You mentioned a little bit about Aristotle and how he has contributed some of his philosophies into your thinking. What should we be thinking? What other philosophers play into or have some different types of input that might help influence the workplace?
Yeah, great question. So one person that comes to mind often for me when we're thinking about employee engagement or anything to do with experience, employee experience and how we, or even user experience, all that sort of stuff, is the Austrian Jewish and Israeli philosopher Martin Buber. So his most famous book is one called I and Thou, and it's just brilliant. It's one of these books that you can pick up even if you don't normally care about philosophy, and go, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That kind of resonates. So he's 20th century Austrian, Jewish, trying to understand how we view each other, and in it, so it's called I and Thou, and the main idea is that he says you can relate to things in kind of two main ways. You can have an I-it relationship, where I might have a relationship, and not a relationship in the sense that you might have with a friend or a family member or something, but like relating to. So I could relate to, my cup of coffee in an I-it way, right? And I'm the sort of subject, I'm the person, it's just a cup of coffee, right? But he says that the other way is an I-thou relationship, where that's how we need to interact with each other. We need to remember that, unlike my cup of coffee, you both are persons, right? You're members of the moral community. You have agency and autonomy. You can choose how to live, all these sorts of things. You're complex beings, right? So I ought not to have an I-it interaction, relationship to you. I'm selling myself short. I'm selling you short. I need to have an I-thou relationship. And he has this great moment in the book where he says, all of life is encounter. And you get the sense that he also thinks that you can't really encounter in I-it relationships. To truly encounter, you have to have I-thou relationships where we're treating other people like people, right? And so I guess when I think about what you all doing with Nexthink and digital employee experience, I feel like that's it's a simple idea, and you guys are the experts on how to make this happen. But I feel like it's an important one to say, so how do you do digital that is based on an I-thou kind of interaction? I think that's the philosophy that I think would be really useful. I say, what that looks like, I don't know, because I'm not a tech person, but I know that's what you guys do. So, but I think that's one that comes to mind, recognizing the individuality of each other, and saying, okay, so how does that inform the way that we do employee experience? How does that inform the algorithms that we write? Those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to look at it. Technologists have a really good relationship with technology, and that's the I-it, right? It's an easy relationship to have because it's different, right? But having the I-thou with the employee that's using technology and interacting with other employees, I think is just, it adds that layer of complexity, but also necessity for us to be able to do our jobs the right way.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah, definitely.
Before we put Martin Buber up on the Nexthink website, final question for you, Brennan. We obviously live, as you say, in an era of huge change and uncertainty. If listeners should pick up just one work of philosophy that might help them to navigate these strange times, which do you think it should be and why?
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom. Great question. So, I said a moment ago that I think Martin Buber's I-thou book is one of those that anyone could pick up and enjoy. But I think if you're talking about the times that we're living in, one that I went back and reread in March last year, and that I've heard referenced so many times in conversations with people throughout 2020, is Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. So Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, someone who really, lived firsthand a lot of difficult times. And actually a lot of the reason it's such a great sort of bedside table book is that it's these really short reflections that he writes, from the battlefield, or, in his palace when he's dealing with a really tricky political coup and, things going on. And it's almost like they're his meditations, right? So they're him trying to sit down and think through things. And the way that he writes it, you almost get the sense that he had an idea that he wanted to hold on to. It was like, oh, do you know what? I want to make sure I don't forget that, because that's a really helpful idea. So he writes it down, and they're all things where he's almost talking to himself and saying, Marcus, remember, next time you go through adversity, don't forget that you can't, don't waste your time on stuff you can't control. So I mean, that's even beyond Marcus Aurelius, that's the one of the really helpful lines of Stoic philosophy, is this idea that you shouldn't waste your energy on what's outside your control. So all the Stoics were really big on saying that the first thing you should do is try to recognize where, what's your situation, and then what's in your control and what's not in your control, and then put all your energy into what's in your control. And basically for them, they thought really the only thing in your control is your mindset. So don't waste your breath trying to change a lot of other stuff, but work on how you receive it and approach it. And that's, there's been a lot of psychologists that have made connections between that and the usefulness for resilience and managing stress and everything. And I think Marcus's meditations are one of the books that people return to, even if they don't normally pick up philosophy books. So that would be my top pick, I'll say.
So it's essentially like as if somebody compiled the tweets of Donald Trump over the last few years, and in 2,000 years, they make for good reading.
Essentially, only
only not. Brennan, absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for coming on. We hope to have you on again in the future, and happy 2021 to you.
My pleasure.
It was really fun.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I've really, really enjoyed it. So yeah, I'd love to have another chat, and happy 2021 to you as well.
And that's the end of this week's especially thoughtful edition of the show. If you would like to learn more about philosophy at work, or read their amazing report, The Virtues of Virtual, be sure to check the show notes. See you next time, Changemakers.
To make sure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to leave a rating of the show. Just tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. If you'd like to learn more about how Nexthink can help you improve your digital employee experience, head over to nexthink.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.